Lars Fredrikson, who is the focus of my PhD thesis, was a Swedish artist who settled in the south of France in the 60s. His first artistic practice, painting, draws upon an early 20th century heritage and the influence of artistic experiments that were described by Linda Henderson as vibratory modernism. And it is successively through movement, light, electronic signals, and finally sound that Fredrikson extended his own pictorial gestures toward a regime of energetic correspondences within a broad vibratory spectrum. Fredrikson's entry into electronic media and sound practices began in the late 60s, and by the end of the decade, he had embraced projected sound as an artistic medium. This unique approach evolved alongside his use of electronic media, as in his audiovisual works on cathode ray TV sets and his fax production. These faxes lie at the intersection between drawing, sound synthesis, and the transduction of energetic phenomena. In this respect, Lars Fredrikson's faxes are an expression of his interest in the intermediate correspondences between the arts within a technical and electronic media environment. This is the body of work I want to focus on in this paper. Lars Fredrikson's faxes production includes images from weather maps and press picture transmissions, which were already common in the field of still image teletransmissions since the 20s and the 30s. And he uses alternatively a French army radio transceiver dating from the 50s and several radio receivers designed for marine use, including one from the late of the 70s, a Niagara fax radio receiver. This unique device was designed by Niagara, a company that was renowned for its pioneering in portable tape recorders. The Niagara fax is a receiver of weather charts by radio transmission for marine and air navigation. This is the only part of the artist's work that is explicitly linked to telecommunication networks. While one might consider classifying it in the category of mail art, copy art, or even telematic art, which are based on two-way communication and network decentralization, it appears that Fredrikson's faxes were produced through simple reception or even interception, rather than dialogical exchange. What's more, the images produced in this context are finished, autonomous, and framed pieces, unlike many of the activities associated with fax art from the 70s to the 90s, which mostly emphasized interaction, collaboration, and relied on the aesthetic of process. Fredrikson's sound and media practices emerged during a post-war period when art questioned the realm of the sensible and the imperceptible. They are therefore characterized by what Douglas Kahn has called a desire for pan-orality, which was prevalent in experimental music and early sound art practices in the 60s and 70s. Radiophony, electronic sound transduction, and microphonics heightened awareness of sound's ubiquity as an energetic potentiality. Fredrikson's work is permeated with a discourse on the relationship between the electromagnetic spectrum, electronics, sound, and the organic and nervous functions of the human body. This materialist intuition was connected to the history of sound correspondences on terrestrial scale and cosmic scales, and was updated and influenced by theories of cybernetics, communication and information, quantum physics, and Far Eastern spirituality, all converging in the mid-20th century in Western arts and culture. By taking inspiration from Sonia Sheridan's experiments with generative systems in the 70s, which expanded the understanding of electrographic technical environments beyond copy art, this paper aims to analyze Fredrikson's faxes in terms of their generative processes to broaden their epistemological and aesthetic challenges. My hypothesis is that these faxes align more with remote listening and sound graphic, rather than with the traditional fax art category, which emerges at the intersection of copy art and mail art. The evidence suggests that Fredrikson accessed these visual transmissions as a receiver. This holds true for weather map services, which operate through broadcasting and do not necessitate reciprocal contact with the transmitting station. And Fredrikson's Nagrafax, which was his primary tool for fax production, only allowed him for reception and printing, emphasizing this one-sided nature of his engagement. Lars Fredrikson's career and work are intricately intertwined with the electronic media and telecommunication technologies that reconfigured the spatial and imaginative dimensions of modernity. When he was a child, in 1937, with a family friend and radio amateur, he witnessed at a distance the crash of the Zeppelin Hindenburg. This event marks a turning point in the practices of telephotography and photojournalism, but also in the history of ham radio, which Fredrikson practiced from the end of the 50s. His cultural context was partly shaped by the fantasy of an acoustic space of modernity proposed by Carpenter and McLuhan in 1960. Despite the artificial division it establishes between sight and hearing, the acoustic space of modernity gives an idea of the reconfiguration of space and time by technically mediated sound and of the fantasies it inspires. The authors give the example of radiophony as drawing the contours of a universe as potential map of auditory space. By 1974, when Fredrikson began producing faxes, he already possessed an extensive experience in navigating distance through technical interfaces. His background as a radio telegrapher in the Swedish Merchant Navy during the 50s and 60s equipped him with the bodily listening skills based on spatial isolation and sensory channeling. Fredrikson was also an enthusiastic DXer, an amateur practice of identifying distant signals or establishing distant communication with remote stations. Because they are based on the search for tuning, which involves probing for electromagnetic resonance or frequency synchronization, these practices of radio exploratory listening reactivate the imaginary of a vibratory sympathy at a distance that first took place within the historical etheric field. This mode of exploratory and blind conquest of distance is also historically associated with the fortuitous discoveries that marked the birth of radio astronomy, and later with remote surveillance and espionage in the context of Cold War. As with telephone line-based fax devices, radio receivers-based fax devices, like the one used by Fredrikson, rely on the transmission and transduction of sound signals. The Nagrafax also features a headphone output, so you can listen to the live reception. And the Nagrafax inscription system is therefore based on sound printing process that can be enlightened by the epistemology of the first recording media of invisible energies and their role in the growth of technical monitoring. Fredrikson's fax generation process echoes the importance of graphic measuring and energy recording during the late of the 19th century in the constitution of a mechanical objectivity within modernity. These automatic measuring devices were rapidly associated with the idea of monitoring, which partly focuses on the distinction between normal and pathological or unwanted phenomena, and thus heralded the first steps of Shannon and Weaver information theory to come. Moreover, a number of later surveillance devices, such as radar or sonar, which enable a detailed examination of the surrounding of or distant spaces, are based on a scanning principle that is similar to that at play in Fredrikson's fax printing. In a significant number of cases, surveillance and monitoring devices rely on the sense of hearing, because it has better capacity than vision to distinguish rapid iteration and subtle variation. Sense of hearing often supplanted vision in technical contexts since the 19th century. everything points to the fact that this artistic production is based on a perceptive attitude and on a technical environment relating to the temporalities and attention modes of surveillance or even remote auditory monitoring. Fredrikson's weather maps offer aerial, even satellite visions, echoing the reconfiguration of cosmological vision that followed the conquest of space, the aesthetic of the map, and the military context of weather facts development. As for the press photographs Fredrikson intercepts, their detachment from their original context and the nature of the apparitions they contain increase their iconic power. Some of them are explicitly tied to war and appear as a troubling reminder of the links between distant vision technologies and armed conflict, the delocalization of violence, teleobjectivity, as seen by Paul Virilio, and even the theories of the entanglement of photography and death. The loss of indexical quality that affects them could be likened to what Eyal Weizmann coined as the threshold of detectability of violence. Oscillating between an approach shaped by the fantasies of the global village and the concern for the geopolitical and military realities of remote viewing, as well as the disintegration and fragmentation of image-related landmarks, we find ourselves at the crossroads of a modern fantasy of connectedness and the very acknowledgement of its failure in the context of postmodernity. I aim to analyze these aspects in greater depth in my PhD dissertation, but that's not what I'll be discussing today. The images printed by Fredrikson are the result of a delocation. To date, we have no means of identifying their provenance or spatial trajectory. Their untraceability calls into question their very nature as copies, but does not annihilate the distance they traveled. Once relocated, they acquire new characteristics. If we follow Jennifer Roberts' assertion that geography inhabits pictures, Lars Fredrikson's faxes visually bear their identity of topological and remote vision images, as well as the traces of their journey. The visual noise that contaminates them is as much an indexical loss as an enrichment, a trace of their transmission, the presence of distance. These qualities of degradation and distortion corresponds to the aesthetic of poor images, as well as materiality intensified by the degradation, circulation, and iteration typical among the practices linked to generative images. This deterioration calls into question the photographic proof, an epistemological doubt intimately linked to the technology of remote viewing. This image contradicts in every way modern desire of visual objectivity and its conception of images as windows to the world. The uncanny and disturbing presence of death and violence in these fax prints turns them into ghost images bearing hallucinatory presences or spectral apparitions that are characteristic of all media reproduction according to Friedrich Kittler. It's tempting to compare them with the omnipresence of auditory specters in the history of sound recording and transmission techniques, especially in the context of what Raymond Murray Schaeffer has subjectively described as a schizophrenic regime that creates a cognitive dissociation between supposedly natural sound and its technical avatar. This dissociation is prevalent in the context of acousmatic and teleacoustic listenings and outlines the contours of undefined spaces that ultimately welcome the wanderings of imagination. These images sometimes disappear at the very moment of their fixation through signal weakening or saturation, and as a result of various disturbances affecting their transmission and reception. In this way, they acquire a similar status to what Kittler has termed writing without a subject in the case of sound recording. By enabling the fixation of noise regardless of its meaning, Fredrikson's device offers an ideal situation for the indiscriminate reception of energetic phenomena. In the sound practice of Fredrikson, Fredrikson develops in conjunction to his fax production. Noise is considered as a subject in its own right. It is a condition of possibility for the message. It is an active third agent of communication in the sense given to it by Michel Serres. This reminds us that sound has successively been detached from musical values and traditional semantic content with the theories of acoustic, the techniques of visible sound and sound inscription, and the development of electronic sound techniques. This gave rise to materialistic perspective among many experimental composers in the post-war. The best known example would be John Cage, who, thanks to electronic technical devices, partly realized his desire to let sounds be themselves, independently of their supposed musical value, their role as noise or message. If, in the context of analogic electronic media of this period, the distinction between noise and message require an observer to be in a superior position than the one of a mere receiver, we might go so far as to say that Fredrikson proposes to the observer the experience of a somewhat liminal zone to any understanding of a message. If I go further, I could say that Fredrikson has internalized the medium and offers to the observer to become that mere receiver in the technical sense of the term. When Lars Fredrikson began using his fax machines, he already explored the acoustic potential of visual experience in a series of audiovisual pieces on cathode ray television sets, into which he injected pulsating sound signals demonstrating the acoustic character of video. This sonic intuition is part of what Wolfgang Ernst has conceptualized as implicit sonicity on the scale of electronic media, providing an epistemological understanding of their technical temporalities. As Ernst writes, when sonic communication is not reduced to acoustic in the narrow sense, but understood as signal events, even vibrational events in optical physics can be identified in their processual sonicity. This idea of an intermediary existence of sound within any electronic system is perfectly suited to issues at stake in Fredrikson's transductive approach. As we have already mentioned, Fredrikson's practice of electronic and sound graphy can be read as a direct continuation of the first energy inscription techniques. According to Douglas Kahn, the graphic recording of sonic or implicitly sonic energies appears as the contraction of underlying complexities. The graphic and optical methods are tied to a fantasy of universal energy language carried by the experimental science and aesthetic reflection at the turn of the 20th century. It is the site of a presumption of analogy between all physical forces that accompany the birth of abstraction in the arts. Lars Fredrikson's images are indexical. They maintain a causal relationship with sound signal. They echo the historical desire for sound graphy as the worthy object of aesthetic contemplation. For the artist, the technical and historical context of electronic transduction represents a further step in the sensitive exploration of invisible energies, leaving the realm of symbolism to embrace that of electronic analog equivalences. Lars Fredrikson's faxes thus echo the sonic line of modernity as a creative potential. They somehow realized the dream of instrumental reversibility, unlimited transposition from one medium to another, and the intermediate meeting of the optical and acoustic realms, famously proclaimed by Laszlo Mlynarz and other avant-garde artists. For Lars Fredrikson not only received images and radio phenomena from the outside in, as a practitioner of circuit bending, he added several audio inputs and outputs to his machine. This DIY modification enabled him to record the sound of his fax machine, but also to inject sound signals into them. He also added an output to his Army fax device in order to be able to draw by himself the implicit sounds received by his machine. Fredrikson's fax production moves away from the traditional modes of analysis of fax art and more generally from the movement of copy art and mail art by contradicting his device's ability to facsimile, to make similar, as well as negating the principles of dialogic exchanges. Fredrikson is not alone in exploring the complex media technical behaviors of his machine, but he brings the idea of energetic reversibility to a new level. As early as the 60s, the artist expressed his fascination with automatic writing in a research project on electroencephalography. Thanks to the fax machine, his dream of drawing without lifting his pencil has come true. He takes this wish to the point of transforming his fax devices into machines for drawing the distance, the one that inhabits the atmospheric communication field, specific to the ubiquitous electromagnetic radiation. To some extent, Lars Fredrikson's fax machines were machines to draw the very act of listening at a distance. Thank you.